So we're in Hebrews 10, and if you guys want to move over to there, that's where we be. That's where we will spend some of our time today. Depends on how far we get through. We may end up jumping to Psalms for a big chunk, but just to kind of just remember where we're all at. We've been looking at the last several weeks, maybe even a few months, at how Jesus is the high priest and how he's the better high priest. He's the best high priest. And then we've been shifting some from there's still that in the passages, but we're talking a lot about how um, the law has been completed and fulfilled by Jesus, and now we're in this new covenant time, and this new covenant time is better than the previous covenant. And so there's a lot of discussion going on this. Just to remember also that the target audience that the author of Hebrews writes this for is for the Jews and the Hebrews there. So there is a big emphasis on this because that's something they were struggling with. And I mean, he spent a lot of time on just the fact that Jesus could be a priest, and that's because that was something that would be difficult for them. So there's that this is something that's difficult for them. So he wants to make sure to thoroughly go through it. So that's kind of where we are. And so we've been looking at this. One other theme that's kind of popped up a couple of times in the last few passages is that the law is the shadow or picture of heavenly things. And he's going to actually bring that phrase up again in chapter 10. So we'll discuss it again, but I just want to bring that up that we're still going to spend some time talking about the law, but excuse me, it is a picture and a shadow of something else. So yeah, that should be exciting. I'm looking forward to it. Let's start by reading Hebrews 10, and we'll go read verses 1 through 4. And let's see, Bill, would you mind reading verses 1 through 4? Get us in there. I think you're muted, Bill.
The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, but it can never, by the same sacrifices, repeat endless year after year, making perfect those who draw near to worship. Otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshippers would have been cleansed once and for all, and no longer have felt guilty of their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sin. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins.
So this is interesting. I personally wonder how the Jews took this because he's basically telling them that that the law is, and he's right, and we'll talk about it. But he's saying that the law is not only does he say the law is a shadow, but he's saying you were never actually saved by the blood of bulls, and that's interesting for me that it says that in verse 4 he says, "For it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins." And I wonder how hard and how heavy that would have hit the Jews when they read this. But this whole thing is really interesting, and I like it when he starts off. He says, "For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very image of these things." So he's pointing out again that the law is not what is real or what reflects reality. It's just a shadow of reality. And the contrast that he has not pointed out yet here is that Jesus is that reality, right? The law is pointing, it is a shadow and a picture of the things that Jesus is going to do when he dies on the cross, when he is the sacrifice for sin. And I'm just bringing this up because he uses this word shadow, which I just love this. And we've talked about it before, but I just love this term shadow because it just points out to that there's no real substance in the law, right? It's not really there. What you're seeing is an outline of something that's missing. And it helps, it might reveal God kind of to some degree, but it's not a great revelation of God because it's just a shadow. Whereas Jesus, in contrast to that, he is the reality of the heavenly things. In Colossians, it tells us that he is the very image of an invisible God. So there's just a difference in the way they talk about Jesus than they talk about the law here. And the law is a shadow. And just one other thing which I love here is the consistency of the Bible, because but when the Bible talks about the Messiah in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, it talks about how the Messiah is the light. And so I just want to read a couple of verses there just to illustrate that, because I get excited about this. And some of these verses are some of my favorite verses. So any chance to jump in there and read them, I'm all for it. Some of them we've probably read several times, but the first one is in John 1, 1 through 4. So let's see. Dad, could you read John 1, 1 through 4 for us?
Oh.
Uh-oh, I caught him off guard.
I've got my electric Bible and it takes me too long to get over there. So I'm trying to get in with you guys, but yeah, get somebody else to read it, John. I mean, I could probably
right.
quote it. John 1, 1 through 4. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. But reading it now, it takes me too long to get there.
All right. Eric, would you mind reading it for us?
No, I will not mind. So I will repeat that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it.
So we see here in the New Testament, and this is not the only place which refers to Jesus as the light, but it does refer to Jesus as the light. And I just love the contrast and the consistency of Jesus being the light and the law being a shadow here. But just so we are all on the same page and just so we can see and say this confidently, let's go to the Old Testament and see an example of this as well. So let's go to Isaiah chapter 49. And we're going to read verse 6. And this is one of my favorite verses, so we've probably read this several times. Let's see. Who's up for reading? John, could you read it? Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6.
Yes, sir. And he said, "It is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth."
All right, so this is this great passage in Isaiah 49. If you haven't read the chapter, I recommend it. It's really cool. But it's a messianic passage talking about the Messiah coming, and he's and describing the Messiah, and he says it's too small a thing that you would be a sacrificer, that you would be there to save just the Jews. And then he says this cool thing: I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. And so there's just this cool picture here that we want to catch throughout the Bible, that the Messiah is actually the light. He is the one. And this idea of light, I'm pretty sure we've done a study on a few years back, but there's this idea that this is the revelation of God. This is, when we see this, this is who we see that God is. We also see, if you want to jump all the way to Revelation, we could also see that there's a literal light that comes from Jesus as well. And when it tells us that there's no need for the sun or the moon because there's light coming from Jesus and he can provide all of that. So there's just this really cool picture, and we don't want to miss it, that Jesus is the light. And it just fits so well that to say the law is the shadow. It's not the real thing. It's not the substance. In fact, it is a result of the light itself. the shadow is created when something blocks the light, and that's what you see. So that's what we're seeing here when he says that in Hebrews. If we want to go back there, that's where we're going to continue through Hebrews. I just love this whole idea here. Does anybody want to say anything before we move on about this idea that the law is the shadow and that Jesus is the light?
Does the light create the shadow, or does the object create the shadow?
So that is a good question. Create kind of is a tricky term here
Okay,
because yeah,
all right.
because you're right. The shadow literally is the absence of the light, right? It's when the light is blocked by something, and then you see the outline of what it is blocked. So and that fits well with what he's saying here. It's for the law having a shadow of the good things to come and not the very image of these things. And the idea here is that Jesus is the light and there's these good things to come and we can't see it directly, but because of the law there's kind of this outline that we can see of those good things, but it's not the good things.
Yeah, well, shadows, you can kind of guess what things are, but you really don't know until you see it, right? And Jesus is the truth. And so in the light comes the truth. And then you can tell what it really is.
But that's an interesting allegory because the more light you have, the less shadow you have.
And you can skew the object as well, right? You can change the position of the light and then you can get the skewed perspective of things. And I think that's a good point here too, because if you focus on different aspects of the law, you might get lost, you might get confused on the actual big picture. I think the Pharisees did this for a while too, right? Because they were thinking that they had eternal life through the law. And I love how Jesus is saying, you think you have eternal life in the scriptures, but the scriptures point to the Messiah. They point to Jesus. So it's all good. It's a good picture.
I said last time, I just think about shadow puppets or just really good choreographers that could have dancers turn into some big old monstrosity, and then you turn on the lights. Oh, that's 7 people waving their arms, you know. So
All right.
Who's casting the shadow? I mean, if the law's the shadow, I mean, you have 2 ways of looking at it. You got blood covering the sin, sort of blocking the view, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then you also, are we talking about Jesus casting? I mean, I don't. It's just a nitpick on the analogy. But the light and dark is a tremendous analogy. But my version has the form, and you use the word substance in your follow-up, and I found that more more suitable, because shadow's a real thing. It's just not the substance, as you said, and the form, and form being a word of substance. So
And I appreciate your nitpickiness in here because I think there is that information is in here because he's talking about when he says it, the shadow of the good things to come. And when he ends it, it's with because they could not take away sins. And I think that is what is missing, is that the law was not actually taking away sins. It was a promise of sins being forgiven, but it wasn't actually doing the forgiving of sins. That wasn't the good things that had come yet. It was actually Jesus who completed and fulfilled that promise by taking away sins. So I think there's some cool pictures even in the nitpickiness. Now, definitely you can't go too far, and you
Mm.
can it's an analogy. It's not necessarily reality, so you can break it down. But yeah, it's cool still.
So if you look at it, I mean, look at Jesus, fast forward and then go back. And if you look at the law, you can see how, I mean, the law just it kind of pointed to, you know, what is kind of righteousness, right? What is God's righteousness? What is, and that's what it pointed to. It doesn't really put a lot of grace and mercy in there. And it doesn't talk a lot about how we should be and what God's real will for us is. That's where we get into the Gospels and we get into all of the Jesus's words, and then he talks about the Sermon on the Mount and how our hearts should be. You know what I mean? It's not only the righteousness, right? And that's important, right? Because sin is bad, but at the same time, there's God's will and desire for us and how to live our lives, and that's, you know, a whole nother thing, right? And that's where Jesus brings that, and he is the perfect and the truth, because it's not just laws and righteousness and judgment, it's also compassion, grace, mercy, right? Full circle, right? And so they had a shadow, and it makes a perfect sense. That was a shadow of things to come, because it's not the full thing, just one aspect.
I think it's a good point, and there you could make the arguments that some of those things that you talked about were in the law, but again, it's not clear, right? There's just a lack of clarity because it's just a shadow. We don't get the full picture. If you take the law and you remove the Messiah and you remove Jesus from it, you're missing the point and you'll miss the picture. And so that's why some of these things are hard to see. And it's a good point.
Well, you asked the question, what were the Jews thinking? How did they respond to this? And I'm going to interject something because of the timing. I mean, even Wednesday night we had a discussion. I continue to struggle with the nature of the hope that Israelites had as a community, you know. And this verse you read in 49, was it 6?
Yeah.
My version, he says it's too small. It is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel.
Yeah.
So how many times I've read and be on the lookout for these verses, because to me that smacks of a promise, but talk about, they don't address it. Nobody goes into this expansion and expounds on what does that mean?
Yeah.
You know, what did they discuss when they discuss verses like that? And then fast forward to Hebrews, what do they hear when they say the law is just couldn't save anybody, so to speak, or did not? We'll go back to the Hebrews verse, but I don't. I would actually like to pause this group and ask. I mean, is this is what I would respond want to respond to as an Israelite, this 49:6. Oh, what is that? What promise? I mean, we have the whole New Testament where Paul goes off, Jesus goes off, you know, talking about the kingdom, and this one's in a context of a world where they think of David and how he, you know, brought all the his enemies to his feet. Or God did, but
So
it's such a hard thing to look and consider.
you're getting me excited to move forward. So I have to hold myself back just a little bit because I think the point that you're making is actually in the next passage, in the next section.
Mhm.
But I do want to bring up, we have time. I think we can jump into it and discuss some more in detail of what you're talking about, Eric. But I just want to make 2 quick points before we move on. And that's the points that he's making here. He's made it before, so I don't feel like we have to spend a ton of time on it, but he does make the points, 2 of them, which is that the law, the sacrifices were not sufficient, and one way you knew they weren't sufficient is because he had to do them every year. And if they really were forgiving of sins, then why would you have to do them more than once? Because your sins would be forgiven. So he does talk about that, and we'll talk about that again in a little bit future too. But and then the other thing that he brings up is that and we've talked about this a lot as well, which is the law does not necessarily change your heart. it is good at showing, as Doug had mentioned, it is good at showing you that we're sinners and we're separated from God, and it's good at showing that gulf between the difference between us and God, but it does not necessarily change our heart. And I think this is one of those things that you were talking about, Eric, is where was their heart? And so to some degree, you're going to have a lot of Jews where their hearts are not after God. They've got the law, they think that might be enough, and it's not necessarily going after God. And we actually see that through some of the prophets, where in Isaiah, even, he's like, you're raising your hands to me, and they're just covered in blood because you guys are just terrible. You're not actually, you're more interested in the ceremony than coming after who Jesus is. But I think there's also some who are on the flip side of that, who they are seeking after the Lord, and there is this hope that they live with, that is exciting them and it is driving them. And so that's how we're going to transition into this next passage here. And this next passage, it's a quote from Psalms chapter 40, and you can see here he's going to quote Psalms chapter 40 verses 6 through 8. So let's, instead of reading this here, let's go to Psalms chapter 40. And personally, I like when somebody quotes these passages in the Old Testament, I like to not just read the quote, but kind of get some context to see what's going on as well, just because often there's even more insight because it's all the same theme. But so we're going to do that this morning. Let's see, I got it jumped over there. Psalms chapter 40, and we're going to start at verse 6. This is a Psalm of David, just a little bit of context. This is a Psalm of David. He does start it off. He's talking about in the first 5 verses. It does seem like he's talking about himself, but then he switches to verse 6. It does seem like there's a messianic aspect of it, and the author of Hebrews is taking that and saying, yes, there is a messianic aspect of it. He only attributes verses 6 through 8 about the Messiah. And actually, if you read Hebrews, he's going to say, he says, that is, Jesus says these things. And he quotes verses 6 through 8. I think there might be more that he's just, it doesn't go specifically with the point that he's trying to make. But so we're going to read more of that. And I think what we're going to see is something amazing, which is we're going to see that David has this type of hope as well. So you mentioned, Eric, that David's, people are looking towards David, but the funny thing is, David's looking somewhere else. And I think that that's incredible that he himself is like, I'm not the anointed one. I'm not with a capital A. There's another anointed one coming. So let's, I got to stop talking. We got to read this. Let's see. Who is up for reading? We got a little bit of a chunk here. All right, John, we'll take you again. Can you read verse 6 through 8? And then Tim, can you read verse 9 through 10? And then I will read verse 11 through 13. We're in Psalms chapter 40.
So I was there, and then I went back. Psalm 46 through 8. Yeah, sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Mine ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. Then said I, Lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me. I delight to do thy will, O my God, yea, the law is within my heart.
Are we,
6 through 8?
Yes. And then Tim, can you read 9 through, I think I said 11. 9 through 10.
Psalm 49, I have preached righteousness in the great congregation. Lo, I have not refrained my lips, O Lord, thou knowest. I have not hid thy righteousness within my heart. I have declared thy faithfulness and thy salvation. I have not concealed thy loving kindness and thy truth from the great congregation.
And then in verse 11, it says, do not withhold your tender mercies from me, O Lord. Let your loving kindness and your truth continually preserve me. For innumerable sins have surrounded me. My iniquities have overtaken me, so that I am not able to look up. They are more than the hairs of my head. Therefore my heart fails me. did I say 13? And 13. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. So here we have this psalm, and it's interesting what David is saying, and we're going to get into that because the author of Hebrews, he's going to get into that specifically with verse 6 through 8. But I just want to point out here in verse 7, he says, Then I said, Behold, I come. In the scroll of the book, it is written of me. And I'm just pointing this out because David does this thing several times in several different Psalms where he's talking, and it sounds like he's talking about himself. And then he says something where you're like, okay, I'm not sure that he's talking about himself anymore. He does this in Psalm 22, I think, is it 22, where he says, Lord, my Lord? No, 10. Anyways, he does this multiple times where it sounds like he's talking about himself, but then he says something, you're like, okay, I'm not sure what's going on here. And I think this is that verse that kind of points out that he's talking about someone else, right? Because if he's talking about the scriptures in the time of David, he's talking about what is that? The Mosaic books, those first 5 books, maybe a little bit more. But they don't talk about David, do they? I'm not aware of any prophecies of David himself, but here he's pointing out that they talk about this person, and so we get the idea that this is about the Messiah, the future Messiah that is coming, because those old passages in the Mosaic passages, they do have prophecy that talk about this anointed one that's going to be coming in the future, and David is definitely points out that there is another that is coming. And so this is kind of why we might tend to think this is a messianic prophecy. On top of that, we have Hebrews who is saying specifically, he attributes this quote to Jesus. And so it's just pretty cool here that we have this. So again, in verse 6 through 8, this is attributed as a messianic prophecy. Verses 9 through 10, there's fewer people who think that that is messianic, but some people do. And then when we hit 11 through 13, a large part of people do not believe that it is messianic. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, but I just want to point that out as we get through here. As we get through here for verse 6, though, it says, Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, my ears you have opened, burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. And then in verse 8, it says, I delight to do your will, O my God, and your law is in my heart. And here is one of those things that we want to catch here, which is that God wasn't desiring for just sacrifice. He was desiring for obedience. He was desiring for one to come who would be fully obedient to him. And that right there is there's no priests that fit that. They may desire to do the will of God, but they don't do the will of God, right? They fall short. This is why once a year when they go to do sacrificing, they have to first do a sacrifice for themselves because they've sinned. But here we're going to have this promise. They have this promise of one who's going to come who's not going to have to do that. He's going to be doing the will of the Lord. And that's just this perfect picture of Jesus. And we have many examples of Jesus who does the will of the Father instead of doing his own will. And I say instead, but they might be similar, they might be the same, but he's focused on fulfilling the will of the Lord. Can you guys think of any examples of Jesus when he might have done that?
When he fulfilled the will of the Lord.
It was clear that he was saying, I want to do the will of the Lord, not necessarily my will.
When he asked him to take the cup from him.
I mean, that's a great example. There are actually others, right? There are times when he says, that the Lord's the one who testifies of me. The Lord's the one who's a witness for me because I'm doing his will. There's just
all over John.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so there's just this great point that the Messiah is this one who is not just a sacrifice. He's not just doing the ceremonial aspect of things, but he is being obedient to God in a way that none of us can be.
So,
sorry.
Go ahead, Doug. No, please.
Yeah, so these verses are great And what's really cool, make you think about the whole Mosaic law and everything. And if you think of when those laws, Moses, God communicated them to Moses, he wrote them down, he talked to the people. But, I really, I think it's a challenge. I think that people need to acknowledge that they have sin. And the law kind of makes it, kind of points to that we have sin, right? And we need to acknowledge that, right? And then we need to go through processes to be cleansed. Okay. And so I think before that, it was like the Wild West. It's just like it is today. If you're not a believer, and you don't believe in this law, what is this, right? You believe in yourself, right? And so that's kind of where those people were, right? And obviously they kept regressing as we do. But I don't think you can do, and I'd love to be cleared. I think it's hard to try to, what does it say? I delight to do your will. Oh my God, your law is within my heart. So to delight to do God's will, I think it's really hard to delight and do God's will if you don't acknowledge you're a sinner, right? And you need to be cleansed, right? And so with Jesus, the plan, the truth coming, he gives us that ability, right? We can acknowledge our sin and we know that we are cleansed through him, which means now we can do God's will. I don't know if I'd say in clear conscience, but you know what I mean? We can do God's will. And I think that I think it's hard to do God's will if you are lost, in your sin. If your sin is, your preoccupation, right? Versus the desire to do what's right. Anyway, sorry for rambling, but
No, I would
good
push
stuff,
it
though.
even a little bit further, Doug, and I would say even for us who are saved, it's still hard to do the will of the Lord. There's times where, saying I will delight in I delight to do your will, oh my God, that means we have to first commit to not doing our will. And that's
mhm,
not an easy thing to do, even for those who love the Lord, because we were born into this rebellion against God, right? That's
mhm.
our nature. And I think it's hard even for us.
Yep.
So
Selfishness is tough.
in trying to just, as I hear this and like the topic, love it. It's a lot of the sense. You ask, what did the Jews think of what the author of Hebrews said, and couple that with what did they believe, and then what did David believe? These Psalms, this included, is very much about here and now. How much David understood some of the words that came out of these Psalms. I wonder about, but it's hard to imagine a person who writes and sings these things not thinking deeply, but he's not a philosopher. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It is in the heart, which is a nice reference, but it's, if you obey my commandments, things will go well. If you sacrifice, I will allow you to continue to walk, allow you to continue to approach me, bless you and your community. And if not, it's not going to go well. It's hard to, the thoughts, and even for Christians and myself, even, I would say, it's hard to think in perspective that it's the promise ahead that moves me.
Yeah.
While when we live our life, it is the here and now, and it's that he is with us now. I'm going to add one more thing. Even in prayer, we know they prayed to God directly, right? I mean, we talk about Moses and approaching the mountain, and now we have access. Well, I think they thought they had access too. And it's so this is about mindset again. And I don't think that Paul was saying anything. I'm sorry, the author of Hebrews, maybe that's a Freudian slip. The author of Hebrews was saying anything profound. That would break their thinking. I think they thought, well, I'm going to sin again tomorrow. I'm going to have to sacrifice again at the end of the year or next week, or there's ignorance, because we had this brief exchange where really the sins that were being absolved were sins in ignorance, or unaware, and the wage of sin is death, right? It's really what hope they were looking for. Most of it still remains the here and now, and that's a way I think the law trained them.
Yeah.
I'm with you now, and I will be with you as long as you obey my commandments. If you don't, I won't. And that's about living, not the future to me. I've gone off a lot, but
No. This is
a confluence
this is good. Because I think what you were saying is accurate, and it is correct. And one of the things that is happening in Hebrews as we're going through it is that the author keeps pointing to passages that point to the Messiah and point to Jesus. And I think and the fact that there was a lot of false messiahs that rose up during this time makes me think that there was this eagerly awaiting for the Messiah to come. They just didn't really know what that meant and what that looked like. And the author of Hebrews is pointing back and saying, they told us exactly God told us exactly what this was going to be. When he talks about Melchizedek, he brings up Psalms 10 and he says, look, the Messiah is going to be a priest, and you guys we didn't put that together, but he told us he's going to be a priest in this order of Melchizedek. And I think this is this other example that he's bringing up. He's saying, we've done all of this ceremony, we've done all this thing looking forward to forgiveness of sins, but we missed that the forgiveness of sins is not happening because of the spilled blood of the bulls and the goats and the lambs and all of that stuff. It's actually happening because of the Messiah back in the past. They were looking forward to this Messiah who was going to come. His blood was going to be shed, and that's where we got forgiveness of sins. And now we see that in the past, and we're like, okay, Jesus died on the cross. That's where our sin was forgiven. And so I guess the point that I'm making is that you're right. There's nothing profound. There's nothing new here. But I think a lot of people were missing it, not because it wasn't new, but just because the focus was on some things that weren't necessarily what God was focused on. And the Messiah is a great example because at this time, in the time of Jesus, they were looking for a Messiah to save them from the Romans, right? That's what they were looking for. And yet the promise of the Messiah came way before there were Romans. And so that was never God's plan. It wasn't, the Romans were never the issue. It was always sin, but they were kind of missing that. And I think go ahead.
Well, they weren't looking for a Messiah as much as they were looking for a king.
Yeah.
But they were missing the point, and that the king was also the priest.
Sure. Yeah.
And so they saw Jesus as a king, and when he didn't work out as a king, they got all upset and they crucified him. But they missed the point that the king was also the coming king, the new king was the priest. And they weren't looking for a priest, they were looking for a king.
And I would have missed the point hugely, no question about it, if I were a Jew in their time. I've now put myself back in the place of the Pharisees in this mindset and the nature of the law being very much sort of a continuous rolling gerbil cage, whatever wheels are. Yet they were trying to obey, create a situation, and talk about a smoke and mirrors, but where they were being obedient to God's law. And this was the most important thing. And the heart is easy to see it kind of not being there. If you're going around in a wheel, you kind of lose it. But only that obedience would bring a Messiah that would throw off their enemies. I would imagine that their mindset was, we're suffering Roman oppression because we are not obedient enough to the law. And the heart was way out. We know that as a fact. The heart was just not there. But you could imagine this training wheel of the law just creating a rote. This is necessary. God to be with us. We must keep doing this. We got to do it better and better. Paul, perfect, right? Perfect in the law. This is proximity to God. And so really what I'm expressing is, this feels like the extension of the mindset of Israel through its history and the training that they had that brought them completely. You don't think anymore. Everything's second nature. I got to obey the law, and you don't love anymore. But you made reference to those people who really did love the Lord and look forward to some hope. And it's the leaders don't express this very much throughout the Israeli history, the history of the Bible. David in his Psalms, yes, but I don't.
Yes. You're right. You're right. Let's jump ahead just a little bit, just because.
7:19. Sorry,
I
folks,
know.
this is
No. This is good. I wanted to go over some more of the Psalms, but you're bringing up a great point, which is actually the conclusion of what I have in my notes, and so I want to make sure that we get there.
Oops.
No. This is all good. This is great. So we were reading Psalms 40. Let's jump to the end of Psalms 40, and it ends in verse 16. Let's see. So I'm going to read verse 16 and verse 17, and it says, am I still in Psalms 40? Yeah. Let all those who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. Let such as love your salvation say continually, the Lord be magnified. But I am poor and needy, yet the Lord thinks upon me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God. And I just love David's heart here when he writes this, specifically the very end where he says, do not delay, oh my God. There's this picture here of his heart of, hey, Lord, this is what I know. This is some of the things that I'm seeking. I know you've made these promises, and he's ending it with, don't delay. Come quickly. Come save me. I need salvation. I need to be saved. Come save me. Now, definitely, there is this aspect of this earthly, temporal salvation that you need when you're in this situation of, things are tough and you're saying, God, come please save me. But if we had gone through those more of the psalm here, we would also see that David's talking a lot about sin and the need for salvation from sin. And so I think there's this idea here of, I need saving, not just from the earthly temporal things and the situation I'm in, but I also need saving from sin so that I can be with you. And I love how he says that, I am poor and needy, yet the Lord thinks upon me. You are my help and my deliverer. And again, do not delay, oh Lord my God. And I want to just bring this back to Hebrews. If we jump back to Hebrews, so let's do that real quick. On my Bible, that's super easy to do. I just hit 3 fingers down and go back. I don't know how that is for you guys. But if we go back to the chapter 9, and we talked about this a little bit last week, this is how chapter 9 ends. It says, so Christ would offer once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation. And I'm just bringing this all back because I think this heart right here that he talks about in verse 28 is deeply tied to what David's heart is. That's how David's heart it is. It is, Lord, I need you. I'm waiting for you. Come quickly. Come save me. And again, we do this as well, even when we pray, hey, Lord, I need your help. I'm stuck in this situation. I need your help. Please save me. But there's also another aspect of it, which is, Lord, I'm a sinner and I messed up and I did it bad. Come save me from my sin. And God does that too. So there's just this cool aspect of this with David's heart of we need to be saved from sin. We need that. And he's eagerly awaiting the salvation coming from the Lord. He says in several times, I put my trust in God because he wants God to save him from all the things that are going on. And so I think this ties in, Eric, with what you're bringing up. Now, definitely there's the temporal aspect, as you mentioned, with the law of, I'm did this and this and this, so I have to pay the consequences. God save me from these consequences. But there's also another aspect of it, which is I'm a sinner and I've been separated from God from my sin. I need saving from that too. And I think there's a heart there as well. I don't know what you guys think. We can wrap it up here, and I'm sure we've got lots to talk about if you guys have things you want to say. But I love this picture that's happening here, where even David is like eagerly awaiting for the salvation of the Lord, and you could try to pigeonhole that and fit that meaning salvation meaning eternal salvation or temporal salvation or all of these things, but I think it's all of it. I think he's eagerly awaiting all of the salvation of the Lord. What do you guys think?
I'm all ears, guys.
I'm surprised. I thought there was going to be lots of people who had. I was excited about this. Maybe I shouldn't have been excited. I'll mellow down.
Well, can we go back to Psalms?
Sure.
One passage in verse 6 that keeps running through my head. And maybe it's because I'm hard of hearing, but it says, my ears thou hast opened. And I think about that the slaves, if they chose to, when they were eligible for their freedom, and they chose not to accept the freedom, but to remain a slave for life, they would take an awl and poke a hole in their ears. They would open their ears. And I think that's what David is saying here is, I have chosen to remain loyal to the Lord for all of my life, to remain a servant of the Lord. So it's just, I read that and I keep thinking about it, open my ears. Well, your ears are already open, so it has to mean more than that.
It's got me thinking, because I wonder how this applies to the Messiah as well. Is this the piercing? There, I have to stop because I'm going to open up a can of worms that's going to take us more than the 5 minutes we have. There's some good stuff in here, Dad. You're right. That's a great point. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this whole thing is, I mean, it's confusing, and I think the thing that we don't, we got to look back at this whole king thing, and the king thing was that was a man thing. That was the people. They wanted a king. You know what I mean? King's a worldly thing. Kings of the world. You know what I mean? And God was like, hey, you don't need a king. You've got me, right? I am enough, right? But no, that wasn't the case. So that's where you get in and you have a king, and they did the king, and we know how that has all ended up, right? And so David, though, was the king of kings, right? As far as the people, and really, I think, as far as God, I think that if there was a king that desired and seeked his will, it was David, right? And obviously, until we have Jesus. And so it's interesting to do that. But the man, it was the people that wanted this king. And so now when you go into the Messiah, and then this king, Messiah, it's the people again desiring what they believe a king is. You know what I mean? That's what they want. That's why when he came, he missed their mark. He missed what they were looking for, because that was not God's intent for a king. It was Jesus, right? And that was what the Messiah, that's who the Messiah is. That's what his deal was. And that's where the Hebrews writers bring it back and saying, look, it's a king, in the order of Melchizedek as a priest, right? That's really what this king Messiah thing was to be, not what you people desire. Anyways, sorry for rambling, but that's kind of, I think it's real. I think we need to understand that this whole king thing is being defined by us, right? And our desires and our selfishness, right? And then it's God bringing the reality of what really, it should have always been about him, right? And he's enough, right, for all of us. So
I think there's a common problem that we all have as people, Doug, which is we think we know what we need, right? And that's not actually what we need. We think the highest, these people are thinking, hey, this Roman occupation is rough. If God got rid of that Roman occupation, everything would be rosy and great. And God is like, that's not what you need. That's actually not your need. Your need is forgiveness of sins. That's actually what you need. And so there's this issue of, I think I know what I need, and I'm telling God, give me this. And God's like, that's, I could give you that, but that's not going to solve the problem. And so he focuses on another area. And we all have that. We all have that problem. We all
Well,
do
so
that.
the reason why I dive into this, and it sounds theological and academic, but I try to constantly relate to the mind that I used to have and those of non-believers. And I'm sitting and sort of try to communicate and explore their thoughts as, you point to Jesus, and it's where was the hope of Israel. And I will wrestle for this year for at least, but imagine the hope without the Holy Spirit. And I get the sense it was always beyond the grasp of David, that he didn't, I'm not saying it dogmatically, but he didn't quite understand the promise that was made to him when God responded to his desire to make a temple. Right? Who is the one? So what was the hope that was in their minds beyond? I mean, they couldn't comprehend that hope. They couldn't grasp it. And how would we grasp it without the Holy Spirit? We're human beings just like they were. We're no different, but we're given this gift of the promise and believing, the gift of faith and the gift of the Holy Spirit to hold us and ground us, guide us, and give us life. They didn't have that. And so when David receives this promise of the one, yeah, I think he was thinking of somebody in the future. He didn't quite, like Daniel, he woke up sick and confused after prophecy being explained to him. And so what do you do with it? Yeah. And so what was conveyed, that what did this mean? When the one comes, what happens?
Yeah.
And I'm just putting myself in the shoes of the Israelites, as with maybe a non-believer.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we're going to have to end. So let's pray, and then let's see. John, would you mind praying for us?
Did you say Sean or John?
I said John.
Oh, I said, well,